What if history was never falling apart, but falling into place? What if wars, peace treaties, global collapses, and sudden shifts in power were not reactions, but appointments? Most people think prophecy is about predicting the future. That's wrong. Prophecy is about identifying where you are in time. More than 2,500 years ago, a man named Daniel wrote a countdown so precise it predicted the rise of empires, the destruction of cities, and the exact moment the Messiah would appear. And it worked. Down to the year. Down to the event. That alone should terrify skeptics. Because if the first part of the timeline unfolded perfectly, the rest of it isn't optional. Daniel's 70 weeks is not symbolism. It's a schedule. A clock that started with a political decree, paused unexpectedly, and is now waiting to finish its final 7 years. The most dangerous part of this prophecy is not the end of the world. It's the rise of a system so efficient, so stabilizing, and so welcomed, that humanity willingly hands it control. The question isn't if the countdown is real. The question is, how close are we right now? What if the world isn't breaking down, but lining up? What if the chaos we complain about is actually a pattern we haven't learned to read yet? Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy isn't written like a sermon. It reads like a timeline. And timelines do one thing well: they tell you where you are. Most people treat prophecy like a guessing game. Daniel doesn't. He treats time like it's measured, scheduled, and moving forward whether we believe it or not. That's why this topic hits so hard today. Because modern life feels like constant whiplash, markets swing, wars erupt, alliances shift, and truth itself feels negotiable. Daniel's message is simple and unsettling. History is not random. It's sequential. And if the sequence already worked once, you don't get to ignore the ending. Daniel wasn't hunting apocalypse content. He was trying to understand when pain would stop. Jerusalem was wrecked. People were displaced. Empires had changed hands. He's reading older prophets, counting years, looking for a window of restoration. Then heaven answers him, not with abstract symbolism, but with numbers. 70 weeks. In his world, weeks often meant sets of years. 70 sets of 7 years. 490 years. That's not poetic. That's structured. Daniel is basically handed a clock. And here's what makes it different from every vague prediction you've ever heard. It starts with a real-world trigger. A decree. A government decision. A piece of paper that would quietly start a countdown that echoes through centuries. That detail matters because history usually turns quietly before it turns loudly. Revolutions don't begin with riots. They begin with signatures. Daniel says the countdown begins when a command is issued to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Not when people feel spiritual. Not when society seems ready. When authority makes it official. That's hard for modern people to accept because we like to think we control the storyline. Daniel says no. The storyline moves when the clock moves. And once you accept that, you start seeing the world differently. You stop chasing every headline like it's the end, and you start asking a better question: what stage are we in, and what comes next if the pattern holds? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Daniel's timeline already worked. The rebuilding happened. The opposition happened. The political tension happened. And then, right where the clock points, Messiah shows up in history. Not vaguely. Not somewhere around there. The prophecy aligns with the public emergence of Jesus, his rejection, and his death. Then Jerusalem is destroyed again, just like Daniel described. This isn't a faith argument. It's a credibility argument. If a schedule hit its targets once, the rational move is to take the remaining targets seriously. And that's why Daniel's 70 weeks isn't just a Bible topic. It's a time topic. It dares you to treat history like it has structure. Then something strange happens. After the 69th week, the timeline pauses. Messiah is cut off. The city falls. And yet the final 7 years do not immediately begin. It's like the clock stops mid-sentence. That gap is what throws people off. But it also explains why our era feels different. It's a stretch of time where God's patience is on display and where the world keeps building the infrastructure for something bigger. Knowledge multiplies. Travel accelerates. Systems become global. The gap isn't God being absent. It's God holding back. The question is not whether the final week exists. The question is why we're still in the pause, and what happens when it ends. Daniel says the final week starts with a covenant. Not chaos. Not fire. A deal. A confirmation of an agreement that already exists. That's important because it means the Antichrist doesn't show up as a cartoon villain. He shows up as a fixer. A stabilizer. A person who can get rivals to sit at the same table and sign something everyone thought was impossible. And if you understand human behavior, you know why that works. People don't follow power because they love evil. They follow power because they're tired. When the world feels unstable, a promise of stability becomes addictive. That's the opening move, not terror, but relief. Not chains, but applause. Halfway through the final week, the switch flips. The covenant is broken. The mask comes off. What looked like peace becomes control. What felt like safety becomes coercion. Daniel describes a moment where the sacred is violated, meaning allegiance is redirected. In modern terms, this is when systems stop asking and start requiring. This is when speech becomes regulated, dissent becomes punished, and conscience becomes inconvenient. People think tyranny starts with violence. It usually starts with policies that feel reasonable until you're the one targeted by them. Daniel's midpoint isn't random drama. It's a hinge. And once that hinge turns, there's no going back to the earlier version of peace. When Daniel talks about worship, don't reduce it to religious rituals. Worship means ultimate loyalty. It means who gets the final yes. When any system demands that your deepest convictions bow to its authority, worship has shifted. That's why this prophecy feels like it was written for an age like ours, where identity, language, and truth are contested at scale. The abomination isn't just a statue in a temple. It's the replacement of God's authority with a human-made authority that claims the right to define reality. That is the real conflict. Because once a system can define truth, it can define morality. And once it defines morality, it can define who deserves to participate in society. Daniel doesn't assume people are stupid. He assumes they're exhausted. That's more accurate. Most people won't surrender freedom because they love oppression. They'll surrender because resistance costs too much. When survival gets expensive, principles start feeling optional. And the more efficient a system becomes, the harder it is to escape it. That's the trap. Dependence makes control look like normal life. Think about how quickly modern people accept surveillance if it's packaged as convenience. Think about how easily privacy is traded for access. Daniel's prophecy isn't merely spiritual. It's psychological. It understands that human beings choose comfort under pressure. Until the price shows up, and by then it's late. Here's the part that changes the mood. Daniel says this ruler doesn't fall because humanity rises up. He falls because time runs out. He is destroyed by an authority beyond human hands. That matters because it removes the two biggest manipulations, fear and hero fantasies. Fear says everything is spinning out of control. Hero fantasies say we'll fix it if we try hard enough. Daniel says history ends because the clock ends. That makes prophecy less about panic and more about clarity. It also means you don't need to obsess over guessing dates. You need to understand the structure and decide what you're loyal to before loyalty becomes expensive. One reason Daniel feels so alien to modern life is his calmness. He doesn't freak out about empires. He doesn't worship leaders. He reports them like a weather forecast. Rise. Fall. Replace. Repeat. That perspective is rare today because we're trained to treat every election, every crisis, every cultural shift as the final moment. Daniel's message cuts through that noise. The world feels dramatic because we live inside it. Daniel steps outside it. He makes history feel procedural. That's not cold. That's freeing. When you realize events have sequence, you stop being emotionally hijacked by every headline. You start watching patterns. And patterns tell you more truth than outrage ever will. Daniel also shows how pressure exposes alignment. People can say anything when life is easy. In comfort, everyone sounds courageous. But when systems demand compromise, your real loyalty appears. Neutrality collapses under strain. Silence becomes a choice. Inaction becomes agreement. That's why the final week is so intense. It doesn't create evil, it reveals it. It doesn't invent faith, it tests it. Modern society is already moving in that direction, where opinions are treated like moral identities and where disagreement is treated like harm. Daniel says the end won't be a sudden surprise. It will be a sharpening of what already exists. Now at the modern layer Daniel could only hint at, technology. Global coordination used to be impossible. Now it's normal. Instant communication, digital currency, biometric systems, algorithmic enforcement, these aren't prophecy by themselves, but they make certain prophetic scenarios realistic for the first time. The infrastructure for global control is no longer science fiction. It's business. That doesn't mean every new technology is evil. It means the world has the tools to do what it couldn't do before. Daniel's prophecy doesn't need modern tech to be true, but modern tech makes it easier to see how it could unfold in real life, without supernatural theatrics. People always ask, who is the Antichrist? Daniel's approach is smarter. He describes what kind of world makes his rise possible. A world tired of conflict. A world desperate for stability. A world willing to trade conscience for cohesion. Names are less useful than conditions. Names create false confidence. Conditions create awareness. That's why Daniel avoids giving you a neat label to slap on a politician you dislike. He forces you to watch the direction of history instead of hunting villains. If you want to take the prophecy seriously, stop asking for a face and start asking what systems are training people to accept control as normal. At its core, the 70 weeks prophecy compresses one central conflict. Who owns the future? Humans love control, but control is fragile. We build systems, then those systems demand worship. We build institutions, then those institutions redefine truth. Daniel's final week is where that tendency reaches its peak. Security becomes the highest virtue. Unity becomes the highest good. And anyone who won't bend is labeled the problem. If you've watched modern culture punish dissent, you've seen the preview. The end isn't introduced as darkness. It's introduced as a bright, efficient solution to chaos until you realize the solution requires your soul. The reason this prophecy keeps resurfacing is that every generation rehearses it. In small ways, history practices the final week. Local tyrannies teach global lessons. Cultural compromises prepare political ones. And each time society accepts a new level of control for a new level of comfort, it lowers resistance for the next step. Daniel's prophecy isn't repeating, it's building. The world doesn't reset every decade. It stacks habits. It stacks systems. It stacks dependencies. That's why the present feels heavy. We're not just dealing with today's problems. We're living inside the accumulated momentum of centuries. So when you see crises today, don't jump straight to end times panic. Daniel teaches a better framework, conditioning before culmination. Systems don't snap into place overnight. They normalize first. They become convenient first. They become necessary first. Then they become mandatory. You can watch this cycle in finance, in speech, in technology, in geopolitics. First it's optional. Then it's recommended. Then it's required. Daniel's final week isn't the beginning of control. It's the final stage of control. And that's why paying attention now matters, not because you can stop the clock, but because you can decide your alignment before pressure takes your options away. Deception in Daniel isn't flashy. It's practical. It's the kind of deception that makes sense. People confuse effectiveness with goodness. They confuse peace with righteousness. They confuse unity with truth. That's the trick. If a leader produces results, people stop asking questions. If a system reduces pain, people accept its terms. Daniel shows that the most dangerous falsehoods aren't outrageous lies. They're reasonable narratives with hidden costs. That's why this prophecy reads like a warning for modern politics and culture. Because modern deception is rarely irrational. It's polished. It's professional. It's marketed as progress. The midpoint collapse isn't just betrayal. It's exposure. That's why it hits so hard. People realize the system they trusted was never neutral. The deal was never just a deal. It was a strategy. This pattern shows up in every major historical abuse of power. First you're invited. Then you're dependent. Then you're trapped. Daniel's prophecy suggests the end will follow that same arc on the largest scale. And the reason it works is simple: the world will be tired. After enough instability, people will accept almost anything that feels like stability. That's when the final week becomes plausible, not because people are evil, but because they're exhausted. Notice how Daniel doesn't sensationalize the moment. He doesn't write it like a thriller. He writes it like it's inevitable. That calmness is terrifying. It implies that the end won't arrive with dramatic warnings everyone recognizes. It will arrive with normal procedures, legal frameworks, and cultural pressure that feels like common sense. That's how large-scale shifts happen in the real world. They arrive looking like the next step. Daniel's prophecy doesn't need fantasy to be frightening. It's frightening because it feels administratively realistic. And if you've ever watched institutions change slowly and suddenly at the same time, you know exactly what that means. Then comes the ending, and it's abrupt. Daniel doesn't give you a long heroic storyline where humans save the day. He says the ruler is destroyed without human hand. Meaning the conclusion is not a human achievement. It's a divine decision. That destroys the fantasy that history is ultimately controlled by human brilliance or human activism. It also destroys the fear that evil is unstoppable. Evil is not unstoppable. It's temporary. It has a deadline. And that deadline isn't negotiated. It's enforced. Daniel's prophecy is not a celebration of darkness. It's a statement that darkness has a limit. That changes what hope means. Hope isn't in perfect politics. Hope isn't in a perfect economy. Hope isn't even in people finally waking up. Hope is in endurance. In refusing to trade integrity for comfort. Daniel frames the end as a test of allegiance, not a puzzle of dates. That means the most important preparation is not research. It's alignment. What do you serve when pressure rises? What do you obey when obedience becomes costly? Those are the real questions, and they apply right now. Because society already punishes certain truths. The final week simply makes that pressure global. People always want the prophecy to tell them how to escape. Daniel doesn't do that. He does something better. He removes confusion. He shows the shape of the road so you can recognize the terrain when you're on it. Awareness doesn't remove suffering, but it prevents surrender. Most people don't fall because they're forced. They fall because they're surprised. Daniel reduces surprise. He gives you a framework that makes manipulation harder. When you know systems follow patterns, you stop being hypnotized by slogans and you start watching consequences. That is how you stay sane in unstable times. The greatest danger in Daniel isn't misinterpretation. It's neglect. When people ignore prophetic structure, they misread conditioning as progress. They accept new restrictions as normal. They celebrate convenience as freedom. They assume stability is always good. Daniel offers a corrective lens. Progress without truth is not progress. It's acceleration toward collapse. And this is where the modern connection gets sharp. We live in an age where speed is worshipped. Faster communication. Faster money. Faster decisions. Faster judgment. Daniel warns that speed without wisdom doesn't save a civilization. It prepares it to be controlled. Daniel's 70 weeks ends with closure, not endless conflict. That matters because modern narratives love perpetual struggle. The Bible does not. Daniel presents evil as temporary, not eternal. The end is not, everything gets worse forever. The end is, time expires and authority ends. That gives the prophecy its backbone. The point is not to scare you with endless darkness. The point is to show you that darkness runs on borrowed time. And if darkness runs on borrowed time, then despair is irrational. The real challenge isn't fear. It's faithfulness. So what is Daniel asking you to do? Not obsess. Not speculate. Not label every headline as prophecy. Daniel invites sobriety. The structure of time reduces emotional manipulation. Fear thrives when everything feels random. Sequence destroys that fear. When you know outcomes are fixed, you don't need to be hypnotized by every crisis. You become steadier. That steadiness is rare today, and it's why this message spreads. People are tired of noise. Daniel offers structure. And structure is calming, even when the content is intense. This is why Daniel's prophecy makes both religious sensationalists and political absolutists uncomfortable. Sensationalists want endless speculation. Daniel gives sequence. Absolutists want to act like their system is permanent. Daniel says no system is permanent. Time outranks them all. That's why prophecy is not just spiritual. It's political in the deepest sense. It denies ultimate authority to human power. It says every empire has an end. Every ruler has a limit. Every system is accountable. That idea is offensive to power, and it is liberating to people who feel trapped by it. The most unsettling truth Daniel reveals is not that the end approaches. It's that human nature is predictable. Daniel doesn't predict monsters first. He predicts patterns, exhaustion, dependence, compromise, then control. We've seen that pattern in history repeatedly. We see it in modern culture in smaller forms. People don't change because they get smarter. They change because they get pressured. Daniel suggests the end will be the greatest pressure event in human history. And pressure doesn't create new loyalties. It reveals existing ones. That's why this prophecy feels personal. It's not about them. It's about what you do when it costs to stay honest. Daniel also corrects a common mistake. We're not called to calculate secret dates. We're called to recognize seasons. Confusion comes from demanding signs when we should be understanding stages. Daniel's strength is that he offers a stage framework. A clock that has already proven itself once, a pause that explains our strange era, and a final week that will close the sequence. Whether you interpret every detail the same way or not, the structure itself is hard to dismiss. It's coherent. It's measurable. And it challenges the modern belief that history is just an accident with better technology. So here's the final point, and it's simple. Daniel's 70 weeks are not a riddle meant to entertain. They are a record meant to warn. History began on schedule. It unfolded on schedule. And it will conclude the same way. The only variable left is alignment, what you worship, what you obey, and what you refuse to trade away when pressure rises. You don't need to fear the future if you understand the structure of time. But you do need to be honest about loyalty. Because the final week, when it comes, won't be a debate. It will be a demand.